I wanted to comment before we go on. This is really interesting that Paul and Peter and much of the New Testament is anticipating that salvation is right around the corner. Even the second coming of Christ was apparently being expected by them in that generation. Even Jesus said some remarkable things like, these things will not, this generation will not pass away before all these things come to pass, in Matthew, when he was talking about as lightning flashes from the east to the west, the second coming. When I come again, you're going to know for sure. You don't even have to go ask somebody, is it the real Messiah? He says, you'll know it. Everybody's going to know it. It's going to be obvious. It's going to be a big deal. And all these things are going to happen within this generation, but they didn't, is the problem. At least not the way it was described. In the book of Revelation, it gets even more serious, and it's a bigger problem. The beginning of the book of Revelation and the end, the first and last chapter, are just straight talk. There's nothing symbolic in them. So John, or whoever wrote the book of Revelation, started out by saying, these are things, I'm about to tell you things that must soon take place. Because, and then he says, heed the words of this book, this that I'm about to write here. Because, and the reason you need to heed these words is because the time is near. And he's writing to 7 churches, 7 actual churches in what is now is Turkey, in Galatia, in that region, and telling them, encouraging them that God is going to come and take care of business against the Roman Empire. It was really what John was writing about, was his grievance with Rome persecuting the Christians. And you find later in the book of Revelation the scarlet, the prostitute sitting on the beast, and Babylon the Great and all that, and the city of 7 hills. Obviously he's talking about Rome. So the whole book is about a grievance against Rome persecuting the Christians, and how God's going to come and put an end to it and slay all the enemies. The problem is, it didn't happen. Okay, it didn't happen in that time frame. And Rome wasn't conquered, at least not in that way. Now, Rome did eventually fall. In a few hundred years, it was diminished. But what's interesting is from then on, the book of Revelation started to morph into a book that's about some other era. And so for 2,000 years now, there have been about 100 different groups or individuals who said, the book of Revelation is about to be fulfilled. God's going to come soon. And they take that same wording, instead of putting it back historically with John, that things will soon take place. It's now things are going to soon take place and the second coming is going to happen, but it never does. It's always the chasing this moving object. And the last one I remember was Hal Lindsey in the 80s. He had a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. And the idea was that by 1988, it'll be 40 years since Israel came into the land in 1948. And 40 years later, which is supposed to be a generation, that would be 1988. And the planets were going to align. And they did. The planets did align in a way that they usually don't. And it's going to pull on the Earth and cause all these things. And the idea was the prediction of the second coming, again, based on the book of Revelation. And the locusts will be helicopters. And, Late Great Planet Earth was the best-selling book in the English language in the 80s. Or in the 70s, whenever it came out. So people really are gravitated toward this, again, like Donna said, drama and trauma. And we like that in TV shows and everything. And we're drawn to that, and we like the drama. And it sells books, but guess what? Didn't happen. And of course, you have people, I think I just talked to somebody recently that said, Christ, the second coming's got to be just any time now with all the chaos that's happening in America. And of course, if you go back to World War I, World War II, even the 60s some, and the revolutionary, the Civil War, people always think we're on the edge of the end of the world. And so this is why this apocalyptic literature, they called it, that was written in the era from before the time of Christ to a little bit after. There was a lot of that kind of stuff written, like the Book of Enoch. And it's always trying to encourage people by giving over-the-top symbolic descriptions of the stars falling from the sky, and the stars are going to fall into the river, and it's going to get bitter water, and it's just always this over-the-top extreme. It's kind of like today, special effects in movies today, right? You do it up really big so it leaves a big impression. Well, they didn't have movies, so what they did is they wrote these things down in high symbolism and just dramatic, worst kind of possible things you can imagine, to, for whatever reason, as a grievance or as a trying to encourage people to hang in there and wait for Christ's return, because it's about to happen. So interesting that the book of Revelation, because it didn't happen, it was not real popular in the early church. It wasn't one of the top books that they thought were authoritative. The book of Revelation and 2 Peter and Jude and 2nd and 3rd John were not highly accepted. And there were other books that the early Christians actually did like and prefer, like Barnabas and the Didache and a few others. But then in the 4th century is when, after Constantine, the politics started to come into play. And we all know how politics works when people start arguing with each other and wanting to weaponize things. The book of Revelation emerged again by Athanasius as a way to identify the downfall of the other Christians now. It's not Rome anymore. Now it represents the other Christians that they disagreed with and want to suppress. And so that's kind of how the book of Revelation became popularized. And once they, in about 387, kind of settled on these 27 books, that's how the New Testament group of books came about. But they were never formalized until the Catholic Church in 1600, after the Reformation, declared the 66 books. But they were kind of held and popular even before the Reformation, certainly by the Reformers, and it's held by people consistently today. But that's kind of a
what year was that?
The church actually took some sat down, had a council, and said these are the 66 books. It was in 1600s.
Wow.
It was the Council of Trent. It was after the Reformation, because the Catholic Church, after the Reformation, the Catholic Church was really ticked. So they had this Council of Trent where all these things are anathema. The curse is on you. And they listed all this stuff from the Reformation to get back at their, more infighting in the church. And it just seems to never end. But probably just one more thing, probably the toughest thing that's said in the New Testament that didn't happen, and I'm not always sure what to do with this, but you have several options, is Jesus said, there are some standing here today who will not taste death until they see me coming with my angels. Okay, he's describing the second coming, and it didn't happen. So was he speaking apocalyptically and just symbolically of he's going to come in some symbolic way, or did he misunderstand? Remember, he didn't even know what day. He said even the Son doesn't know when he's coming. In other words, he was saying, I don't know when the second coming is. Did he make a mistake, or was this something that was added to elaborate the words of Christ in the New Testament writings that came down to us. It's kind of tough to sort out, but I bring this up because Paul is clearly saying, hey, we're right on the verge of salvation. And it didn't happen. But so what scholars, well, Christians tend to do today is say, well, he didn't mean it's about to happen. He meant it could happen at any time. When it does happen, it'll be quick. So there's always an explanation for how after things don't work out, you come up with a new explanation. Just like people who predict the end of the world and it doesn't happen, they go, well, my calculations were wrong, like Harold Camping did a few years ago. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's just a little sidebar on people and books that predict the future, but it doesn't happen, and then where that goes. And that's kind of what happened with the book of Revelation. And one more interesting thing about the book of Revelation, it's so opposite in attitude and toward people from like the Gospel of John, that is all about God loving his world and coming to save it. And the book of Revelation is all retaliation and violence. And interesting, it never in the whole book of Revelation ever says God loves anybody or anything. Nothing about love. It's all pure retaliation and violence and getting back at somebody. And the problem, good, bad, right, or wrong, and whether this is inspired or not, it's come down to us, and it's kind of become the basis for people believing that God's going to act in horrible, terrible retaliation against most people, and only the few that believe, or the elect, or the whoever special group are going to make it, and the rest are all toast forever. And this really comes because we've carried with us through church history the book of Revelation and the impact of it. And it is quite a spectacularly written book. If you read it, you scratch your head and go, what is going on? This would make a great movie. But anyway, that's just a little history of the book of Revelation and expectation that salvation is right around the corner. This has been going on for 2,000 years. Okay, any thoughts on any of that? I'll probably get somebody calling and asking questions about that one this week.
About Revelation, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, you had mentioned, did you mention that they aren't sure who wrote the book of Revelation, or is it assumed that John did?
Well, they don't know for sure. I'll tell you the problems with it. It's the positive part that John the Apostle wrote it, the same guy that wrote the Gospel, is that kind of traditionally it's come down that same John wrote it. But there's another theory that there's a John the Elder, or the John of Patmos, or the other thing is apocalyptic literature was often, almost always, was written by somebody in the name of somebody else, like the book of Enoch. It wasn't written by Enoch. The apocalypse of Abraham. They even have an apocalypse of Adam. Well, Adam didn't write it. They wrote it in the intertestamental period in the name of Adam. And so you I don't know if they're stealing their name, but to get some notoriety, they use a popular name. So it could be John wrote this, and it could be somebody wrote it in the name of John to give it some, in the spirit of John and that kind of stuff. Except, like I said, the book is so opposite from the gospel in the tone and in the lack of love for humanity and just God coming through and solving his problems with violence. It just seems more like somebody is expressing their grievances. The other interesting thing is the grammar. The Greek grammar in the book of Revelation is much poorer. It's poorer grammar. It's not as good a grammar as the gospel. So if it's still John that wrote it, maybe when he got older, his grammar kind of evaded him, but it's not as sophisticated of a writing as the Gospel of John.
Yeah, I
And
mean, it almost strikes me like
but it is
something
very,
makes me.
huh?
Well, it almost strikes me as a book that maybe the religious folks threw in there. It's kind of like the used car salesman. You better act on this now because somebody else is going to be here in an hour to buy this car.
You got it, buddy. But it really happened not back then. It happened in the 4th century, like I said, with Athanasius, and they were fighting once Constantine came along and said, I'm going to make Christianity the state religion, then it freed everybody up to start fighting each other, and they did.
Yeah.
And that's what brought the councils, and they brought councils to say this is what the truth is. And the Arians, which is the modern day Jehovah's Witnesses, and Marcion, and all these heretics that they called heretics that had a different view of Christ. And there were 4 or 5, 6 different views of how much is he all human? Is he half and half? Is he all divine? You know, they had different views. And to solve it, they had a council in Nicaea and said, this is our view of Christ. And the book of Revelation and 2nd Peter and Jude are very convenient writings because they're focused on the destruction of heretics, of those who don't bring the right gospel. So it's kind of a little bit interesting that in the 4th century, that's when this got popular, and that's when they formulated the canon of the New Testament. Even though, by the way, the books, 20 of the New Testament books have always kind of been held as the authoritative books, and that would be the Gospels, Acts, all the writings of Paul, and 1st John and 1st Peter. But the other 7 books are questioned for different reasons. Even up through Martin Luther didn't really think that 7 of the books should be part of the New Testament. And that would be Revelation, 2nd Peter, Jude, 2nd and 3rd John. And he didn't like James and Hebrew because they're so Jewish in their flavor. It was too Jewish for him. He wanted the Gentile version of the gospel. But I think James and Hebrews are great books. I mean, I don't have any problem with those, but Luther did. So even as late as Luther, there's a question about which books belong in the New Testament.
So if Revelations was around 400, that would have been about the time of the hell.
No. Book of Revelation was written probably in 90 AD.
90 AD.
Yeah, 90, yeah. But then, like I said, there are people, there've probably been, and I'm not exaggerating, there's been about 100 people in history who've all said the book of Revelation should be applied to right here and now, this group of people or these heretics or this time frame, and all of them have failed. But they keep re-upping and going, oh no, it's now. Now it's gonna, like I said, all the way up to Hal Lindsey. And even today, there are people who go around and go, this is, the way America's going to hell in a handbasket, the second coming's got to be right around the corner. And you have Christians they're reading the Left Behind series and there's a lot of money to be made, and again, in drama and trauma.
I think there was a religious cult in, I want to say Africa, Congo, something like that, where over 100 of them have basically starved to death because this pastor said, this is the end, and this will bring you closer to God. And, it's just, it keeps repeating.
It does. I mean, you had Jim Jones and the Kool-Aid. You had the Heaven's Gate folks that were waiting for the meteorite to pass by, the asteroid, and take them with them, and they all drank some stuff. And this is a long history of people. There's something funny and religious about people, that they seek some kind of, they fall into listening to somebody's idea and making it an absolute. And I think because people are searching and wanting some absolute, somebody is going to tell them the absolute truth, and it's not that clear and obvious. I mean, God apparently leaves it a little bit ambiguous. I think, this is just my theory, so that we'll seek him. We won't seek a church as authority. We won't seek our parents as authority. We won't seek a guru or a pastor as authority. We won't seek even a set of writings, as good as they are, as the ultimate authority, but we'll seek him. We'll close the book, read the New and Old Testament, and it talks about God, and we'll close the book and say, God, I want to know you. Remember, Jesus promised to send the Holy Spirit, not the Holy Bible. Okay, that's the focus, is that indwelling spirit that you can know and you can have a communication with, and to trust that, not someone. It really comes down to, when they say trust the Bible is your ultimate authority, they're saying trust our interpretation of the Bible. Because that's what always, they don't, if you look at doctrinal statements, they don't write down all the verses. They write down their take on what the verses mean, and then they give verse references. And what they're doing is they're saying, okay, this is what it says, but this is what we think it means, and this becomes binding on you. And that's why we write up a doctrinal statement. I asked a guy once when I was younger at church, I said, if the doctrinal statement perfectly represents the Bible, then why do we have it? And if it doesn't, I mean, why do we need it? And if it doesn't represent the Bible perfectly, why do we have it? And he said, I don't know. So, but it's okay for churches to have doctrinal statements, say we as a collection of people were like-minded, and this is the conclusion we've drawn about what the Bible means. There's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes it takes on an authority of its own. It's bigger than the local church and bigger than everything, and you have these doctrinal statements. Oh, I just posted a thing on Facebook of the history of doctrinal statements and creeds. And I pointed out that all the early creeds, none of them talk about hell and damnation. Not the Apostles' Creed, not Nicaea, not Chalcedon, not Constantinople. All those creeds, none of them until almost 500 AD ever mention hell and damnation. And all of a sudden it pops up in the pseudo-Athanasian Creed, which Athanasius did not write. And then and that was after Augustine wrote City of God and started to vividly describe hell and damnation. Then the Catholic Church ran with it, and it became their, what they used to scare the hell into everybody. Yeah. And it's great crowd control. But most people think what we believe today goes all the way back to the New Testament, and it doesn't. It just doesn't. The early church were, and their creeds reflect it. They never talked about warning about heaven and about going to hell or anything. They did talk about the resurrection and eternal life, but it's strangely missing.